Now, Mr. Galloway, we heard Dmitry Peskov say that there was no significant reason for optimism when referring to the recent talks with the U.S. What's your take on the recent discussions? Do you see any glimmer of hope?
Well, talks are better than no talks. Jaw is better than war, and it may very well be that 2022 does end up in war, because these talks are definitely going to the wire. The United States is kicking the can down the road until tomorrow now, and maybe taking up Stoltenberg, the Norwegian coiffeur, his comment that success would be to agree to more talks. But eventually you have to pick up the can and look at what's inside it. And what's inside it is empty of trust, as the Russian foreign minister said. And it's clear enough that at this stage, maybe they'll change their mind tomorrow, they are not going to agree to Russia's core demand, which is twofold. One, that Georgia and the Ukraine will never join NATO, and two, that weapons, US and NATO weapons, will never be placed on the border of Russia. Now, actually, neither of those is an unrealistic demand. Both are entirely logical and rational. But if the United States does not agree to them, then Russia will respond. They've made very clear that they will respond in a way that reduces the security of NATO countries. And that can only mean a military response.
I see. And a spokesperson for the U.S. State Department, Ned Price, he specified the U.S. has a lot of leverage, he says, when it comes to the Russian Federation. Do you interpret that as a means to not wanting to work things out diplomatically?
Yes, what they mean is, and this is their first recourse every time now, sanctions and punitive actions. They've lost the art of making a deal. At least Donald Trump was a deal maker. He could sit down in a smoke-filled room, although they don't really fill with smoke anymore, but he could stay there as long as it took to get a deal. But the United States now is not in the business of deal making. It's in the business of threat and punitive sanction. But this is a diminishing return, this weapon, you know, because one of its consequences has been to transform Russia and China into more or less one country, certainly one ever closer bloc on military matters, on economic matters, on currency matters. So the more Western sanctions there are on Russia, the more Russia moves to the east. And it's with the East that the West has its biggest problem because, as you know well, the sun rises in the East. And economically speaking, it sure is rising in the East now.
Mr. Galloway, do you think NATO will ever abide by Russia's terms not to expand NATO and to remove weaponry from former Warsaw Pact countries?
Well, if they're sensible, they will, because they should not assume that the Russians are making empty threats. I don't think that President Putin's the sort of man that makes empty threats. He's a cautious man. He doesn't threaten much. But when he does threaten, everyone has to take it seriously. And the threat is clear, that Russia will take military measures if the NATO alliance ever expands into Georgia and the Ukraine, and will take military measures if these threatening weapons, minutes from Moscow, it's important that your viewers understand this, these weapons can fire missiles that are minutes from Moscow without warning, and which can annihilate Moscow. Only a fool would allow such a thing to happen, and whatever else you think of him, President Putin isn't a fool.
And what happens if the talks break down? What are the chances of military conflict in Ukraine at this point?
Well, I predicted on this show just before Christmas, New Year, that I think the chances are high, more than 50-50, that there will be a military conflict between Russia and the United States, because, again, your viewers need to know this. For all this talk of we're not going to negotiate this without our NATO partners in the room, these NATO partners are mere cosmetic adornments. Norway doesn't have an army. The Netherlands doesn't have an army. Italy isn't going to fight Russia. If there's a shooting war, it's between Russia and the United States. And American mothers and fathers need to know that no soldiers will be sacrificed from Belgium. Any sacrifice will be made by Americans.
Interesting. Well, George Galloway, we are unfortunately out of time, but we always appreciate your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.